This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider Video Interviews, we'll be talking about the life and career of filmmaker Stanley Kubrick with two experts on his life and career, Jeffrey Cox and Darren Foley, and that will begin in just a minute. We're back with Jeffrey and Darren Foley, and I don't like to presume people are always going to know about the topics we're talking about, but Stanley Kubrick, of course, was a famous filmmaker, and I'm going to have these two people who are interested and experts on his films and career talk about him. But before we get too deep into Stanley Kubrick, I want to give each of them a chance to talk a little bit about themselves, their background in film and or criticism, and what drew them to the work of Stanley Kubrick. So, Darren, why don't we start with you, since D comes before G. So Darren, if you want to tell a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm just coming at this as a fan from Stanley Kubrick films, basically. I think the reason you asked me on the show was because I run a little site called Must See Films that focuses mainly on film analysis. And really the videos that I've been making is really a side effect of my own kind of study of films. So I got really interested in studying narrative and learning to become a filmmaker. So in my own study, the things I would be sharing were the things I was learning through my study, and I just shared them in videos. And as I've been learning different things, you realize that there are different techniques that different filmmakers have used. Filmmakers view each other in different ways, and that's when you realize that Kubrick is really the gold standard for this kind of thing. That's what's kind of really drew me back to his films, the way that other filmmakers speak about him. And that's when I began to kind of investigate his life more to see what were the kind of things in his life.
Can you speak up just a little bit more, Darren?
Yeah, sorry, can you not hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you a little bit better now. But
I was maybe too far away from the PC there, sorry.
Okay.
No, I was just saying that Stanley Kubrick seems to be so highly regarded by other filmmakers, and there's just this special quality about his films, and I was just, it's an investigation really, and his work kind of led me to the fascination about him.
Okay. Well, Jeffrey, can you give a little bit about yourself, any works that you've written about Kubrick, and what draws you to his films?
Yes, I'm an historian by training, and my area of expertise is modern Europe, modern Germany, Nazi Germany, and the Second World War. And I guess I was interested in Stanley Kubrick before I knew I was interested in Stanley Kubrick, because my dad took me to see Dr. Strangelove in California in 1964. And of course, I had no appreciation for most of what was going on in that film, but I remember enjoying it. And then when I was in college, I went to see 2001 in Cinerama on Hollywood Boulevard. And that had a tremendous impact upon me and my friends. And subsequently, I became convinced that film can be an excellent way of helping to teach students about history. And so I would use Kubrick films among others, but it wasn't until I saw The Shining that I began to think in terms of what Stanley Kubrick thought about history and how his life and career might reflect some of the great crises of the 20th century.
Well, one of the things we'll talk about once we get to The Shining, I know Darren had done a 10 or 12-minute video about his analysis of The Shining, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the show. So you look more of Kubrick from a historical perspective rather than a cinematic perspective. Is that what I'm getting?
Well, that's right. Kubrick, like anyone, is influenced by his life and times, and you could argue that he's more influenced as an artist and as an extremely perceptive boy and adolescent and adult than most other people. He was absolutely fascinated with the human condition in the modern era. And so my training in history allowed me to make certain connections and establish certain contexts, understanding his concerns and how he expressed them on film.
And he was also started out as a journalist himself, right? With it wasn't Life magazine, but it was as a
right, Look magazine, a photographer, Look magazine. His father gave him a camera, a still camera, and he began his career as a photographer and then made the transition into film in the early 1950s.
Yeah, and the first films he did were documentary films, which I was just talking with another fellow about, Antonioni. He also started, Michelangelo Antonioni and Kubrick both started out as documentary filmmakers.
That's right. Short documentaries, Day of the Fight is one of his famous ones, and then some others on other subjects. And even then, perhaps it's retrospective, but if you look at those short films, you can see certain signs of the Kubrick that was to come.
Well, let me just turn to Darren then, since we've established you're more focused on the historical side. Since Darren, since you a filmmaker yourself, and you've done actual little short films analyzing assorted films, what draws you to Kubrick as a filmmaker in terms of his cinematic blocking of shots, the way he edits shots? You know, your typical Hollywood director of the 1950s and 60s when he was just getting going.
Yeah, well, there's two things. I was talking about Stanley Kubrick, the kind of gold standard filmmakers. It's really split into the craftsmanship of how he was able to construct a film, and then with what you were saying, Jeffrey, about the types of stories that he was telling, which are deeply complex and very ambiguous stories with a lot of grey in them. And I think it's really the coupling of those two things that have made his films so rewatchable and so rewarding for multiple viewings. And I think that's what's made them timeless rather than timely and current films, like when he made a war film during the war period. It wasn't that it was timely, it's a timeless film because it's a Kubrick film.
Which one were you talking about? Paths of Glory, or?
No, sorry, what was the other one?
Full Metal Jacket?
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking of the
Yeah. Now, from a historical perspective, Jeffrey, what I know there were some failed films that, or not failed films, but projects off the ground Kubrick, such as a Napoleon film he wanted to do that I guess was financed, and then it was pulled because another company had 6 months earlier or something released a similar film. I know he wanted to do a Holocaust film. What were there other historical projects that never saw the light of day as well?
Well, there were a number of those, and one of them that comes to mind was one that Kubrick later said he couldn't remember at all, called The German Lieutenant, which he wrote a screenplay together with a veteran of the Korean War, and it had to do with the experiences of a young German lieutenant in the Wehrmacht at the end of the Second World War, his experience of meaninglessness in the war and after the war. And from the screenplay, which is not available except, well, I suppose it might be available now in the Stanley Kubrick archives in London, but when I found it, it was in the Department of Defense files at Georgetown University. So it's interesting, in the 1950s, it's not surprising that the U.S. military was collecting material on anything having to do with past, present, or future wars. At any rate, in The German Lieutenant, in that screenplay from the 1950s, The German Lieutenant, you get typical Kubrick characterizations of, not rather than heroes and villains, it's very complicated human beings who are in various shades of gray, as Darren was saying, and it makes us think in terms of what it means to be human, which, again, as Darren said, makes Kubrick's films timeless, because he presents us with characters who are confronting life as it is lived, rather than living up to certain stereotypes that movie viewers might expect or enjoy. And even though he didn't make this film, again, like his other projects in the 50s that never came to fruition, you see a style, you see an insight, you see great learning, a great understanding of history. I see a connection between The German Lieutenant and his film, The Killing, where one critic, I forget who it was, said that what you get in Kubrick is a bunch of lovable losers. He seems to have sympathy for the human condition, is that it's not a matter of good and evil. It's a matter of human in all of their complexity with a world that is at best indifferent, if not unfriendly.
Yeah, I know that Kubrick, during Strangelove's filming, I know there was a lot of people who thought that he had inside information, and supposedly one of the stories, apocryphal or not, is that the war room was supposedly eerily like the supposed real war room, and then also in 2001. People thought that he had inside information on what NASA was doing, but I don't know. Are they mostly apocryphal stories?
I think what it's a sign of is that Kubrick just did his research. He was reading all the time. That's one of the reasons he only made 13 films, if you count Spartacus in that list, is that he took a great deal of time reading and researching and thinking. The story I heard about Dr. Strangelove was that he got all of the details about the interior of a B-52 from Jane's All the World's aircraft. So it's amazing how, even in a pre-digital age, how much information is available in spite of the best efforts of agencies to keep them secret. So I think it's not a matter of conspiracy, it's a matter of magical powers. It's his research, which is something I, as an historian, can appreciate and admire.
Well, Darren, let me turn to you and just ask, and let's wrap up this first little section before we head into each of the individual films. What do you think is the overarching thing about the cinematic visual style of Kubrick that sets him apart from, say, an Orson Welles or a John Cassavetes or other American directors of the time, or any world directors even as well? He seems to always have these I mean, there's the famous look from underneath the brow that appears in 6 or 7 films of a character. What do you think is about him that that sticks the most?
Yeah, would you mind if I just say a little something about when you were talking about the research there, actually, because I went to the London Kubrick Archives just to visit when I was down there, and one of the things that was so fascinating about that place was, even though he only made a few feature films throughout his lifetime, he was like constantly researching and trying to find material. So I looked at this A3 sketch pad he had, and it was full of newspaper clippings of just anything that he found interesting that could eventually turn into a concept for a film. So even though he only made so many films in his lifetime, he was constantly searching for material that would turn into something. And I think I've seen in interviews with his wife that said that it's frustrating him that he couldn't find enough deep stories that would translate to the big screen. But in terms of what we were talking about visually, Kubrick's styles kind of evolved a little bit through some of his earlier films. And then some of his bigger films, they have their almost own styles into themselves. Like I watched Barry Lyndon earlier today, just in preparation for this, and it's the zooms in Barry Lyndon, the zooms in, the zooms out. But then in The Shining, it's the Steadicam, it's the iconic camera movement from those films. So it's very different from every film. And that makes a lot of sense for Kubrick because he touches on so many genres for the different types of films that he makes. So it makes sense that he doesn't repeat himself in that many ways. But having said that, there's a very distinct Kubrick feel that you get from all of his films that kind of unite them a little bit, you know.
I think I saw a documentary a few months ago about the cleaning out of the Kubrick archives, and it was just about a 60 or 70-minute documentary about them just cleaning out. I think they brought the stuff from London over to Paris. It was one of those documentaries that you wonder why they do it. I mean, it's interesting to a degree, but even famous people have junk. But it was interesting, all the stuff that he clipped, and he probably had 100 times material or ideas for 100 films that never were realized. But let's end this segment, and in the next segment, let's talk about the early documentary films of Stanley Kubrick, and then the stuff in the 50s before he became sort of an icon. And we'll do that in a moment. All right, in this segment, let's talk about the early filmic work of Kubrick. And we'd mentioned he started out, like a number of well-known filmmakers, as a documentarian. I do remember seeing the one, I think I saw it on YouTube, about preparing for a fight. There was also another one. I think he did sort of like an industrial film. I see him like I remember him interviewing an industrialist of some sort. Let's talk about before we get to the actual fiction films. How did he make his break in from being a photojournalist to doing the documentary films? Jeffrey, do you know?
Well, I'm not sure in terms of cause and effect. It seemed, I suppose, a natural step for him since his photojournalism was characterized by his usual combination in his films of realism and surrealism. And I think he saw film, obviously in the early 1950s, as the then dominant form of expression in the 20th century. He had spent a lot of his youth and his adolescence going to movies. And then after the war, when he moved out of the family home and into his own life as a photojournalist, he spent a lot of time going to the Museum of Modern Art, watching films in those various series, right up until the time he left for Los Angeles in 1955. So I think it was a reflection of his own great knowledge and interest in all the films he saw other people making. And then he would naturally start with documentaries because they were cheap and easy, and then could graduate to his own produced films.
Darren, have you seen any of the early documentaries of Kubrick?
Yeah, things like Day of the Fight, and I think the reason that some of those are just so gorgeous to watch is because of his photography training from such a young age. And he actually developed his own film himself, and he went through that learning process and created his own dark rooms. So he was very well skilled at a very young age, coupled with a very unique eye for shots. It makes it very iconic things to kind of look back on. And so you can see some of that early magic in his earlier films.
Yeah, I think in one of the films that might have been the industrial film, but there's a shot that's going down the street that's almost, I think, a similar shot to, I think it's not The Killing, maybe Killer's Kiss. There's a famous sort of like negative shot of you. There's a shot in Killer's Kiss where it's going, yeah, and it's all. Yeah, and there's almost in one of the early documentary films, there's almost a shot that's a precursor of that. That's another famous Kubrick thing, that like in The Shining, where he's going down the hedgerows, and also in Paths of Glory, when Douglas is going through the trenches. So even early, he seemed to have his own sort of little stylistic ticks. So let's go over. The only one of the fiction films that I haven't seen of Kubrick was the very first one, Fear and Desire, although I know it's on, I think, Netflix or YouTube. My wife wants me to see it. So that one's only about an hour, and it's about, I guess, it's a war melodrama. I think that was filmed in Northern California, I believe. What can either of you tell about that film? Any import or whatnot?
Well, Kubrick would be glad that you haven't seen it, because he said that he didn't want anyone to see it because he regarded it as a rather clumsy, amateurish effort. And indeed, if you've seen the other Kubrick films, you will find Fear and Desire a disappointment in terms of content and form, although again, there are those moments in the cinematography and in the storytelling and the characterization that point to a future maturation.
That had Paul Mazursky. That's
Paul Mazursky
was in that.
Yes.
And then after that did come, I believe, Killer's Kiss, which has the famous fight scene with in the marionettes, and then there's the running across the rooftops of Brooklyn, I believe it is. So that one seemed to come out. Well, actually, I guess that one more so seemed to come out of some of the early documentary stuff. Darren, what can you tell us about something like Killer's Kiss? Because that's really, I guess, his first one that you get the Kubrick vision in.
Yeah, it's pretty much an extension of his photography work into his first film, because the narrative of that film is very simplistic, and there's one of my favorite Kubrick shots in that film where they do this thing in cinema where they show somebody somebody looking at something, and then they cut to they cut to what they're looking at, and they cut back to a reaction. And there's many filmmakers that have tried to combine those three shots in one shot. So you would do things like have somebody wearing sunglasses, and you can see the person looking and the reflection on the sunglasses. And so what Kubrick did in this film was to put the boxer in his room, looking through the window with the lady across from the other house, and just next to him is the mirror, so you can see him looking and his reaction plus what he's looking at. And it's a gorgeous shot where you can get so much point of view of different characters and character reactions and emotions, very well crafted into just a single shot. And so that for me is the kind of highlight of that film, because it's Kubrick really put in some sophisticated things together in that film.
And in Killer's Kiss, there's several instances of Kubrick's famous reliance upon depth of field, using a wide-angle lens so that you can see everything is in focus in the shot from front to back. And there's a shot, an otherwise unremarkable shot of Davy, the boxer, in his little room with his little, there's a sink there, and then right next is a little table with a hot plate on it. Obviously, he lives in modest circumstances, but on the wall, and you can see it because it's a wide-angle lens shot, and so everything is in focus. Behind him on the wall is this, and it's in the kitchen, so it makes it appropriate. It's a knife, but it's not a knife, it's a machete. And just that shot of that machete against the wall is an habitual Kubrick use of space and object to make a point, because you see that and you think, oh my gosh, what is that machete doing on his wall? And on the one hand, it's realistic because, okay, it's what he uses to cut up his meat or whatever, but it's also surrealistic because it's a sign of violence temporarily contained, but violence that will, of course, become manifest in the course of the film. So the use of objects and depth of field is an early Kubrick technique that characterizes his cinema throughout his career.
Now, you'd mentioned that the first film was rather forgettable, and Kubrick didn't himself think highly of it. Was he much kinder on his second film? Because from what I've always read, it wasn't really until The Killing with Sterling Hayden, his third film, that the critics, really started to take note. Was Killer's Kiss kindly received?
I think it wasn't widely received. I think there were some nice things said about it. I forget who it was. Somebody very famous at the time in New York said he liked it a lot, and I can't remember the name now, a major critic at the time, saying this is somebody to watch, even though it was an early effort and it was very much guerrilla filmmaking. He just went out with his movie camera. It was what's the name of it? The camera that was used in the Second World War, Aeroflex. That soldiers used in battlefield circumstances. And so in some ways a very rough film, but it did receive some nice mentions, because people could see this guy knows, as Darren was saying, he knows something about photography, and even though the story is simplistic, he knows something about filling that story and surrounding that story with content and form that makes us look and feel deeper when we
then came out, and that really attracted notice from him. And this contains another major Kubrick trope that recurs through his films. That is of the mask. There's the famous shot of the gangster with the clown mask. Then we get masks throughout some of the other films, all the way to the end with Tom Cruise and the final film, Eyes Wide Shut. It occurs maybe 5 or 6 times, major motifs in the rest of his films. So Killer's Kiss had Sterling Hayden, who'd later beat General Jack Ripper in Strangelove. But this is basically a caper film, and it's very much in the style of film noir. But for me, it goes beyond your typical film noir in that it's more than just a mere melodrama. With those kind of symbolic things, it seems to be operating not maybe on a Freudian level too, but there is something deeper. Other than what I just mentioned, Darren, are there any visual motifs or things that stand out in something like The Killing, rather, for you?
My favorite thing about that film it's just the characterization of all the characters. It's the first time we've really seen Kubrick handle that many characters of a kind of ensemble level and have working against each other. So it was just great to see that he could work with actors and draw really great performances from people, as well as a much more sophisticated narrative that he worked with before. So you can see that there's definitely progression in his filmmaking ability at that point.
Jeffrey, do you have any comments on The Killing?
Well, Kubrick was very flattered that at least one, or perhaps more than one critic, noted the similarity in the structure of the story that's told in the film to that of Kurosawa's Rashomon. In other words, it's not a straight narrative. You don't start at the beginning of the story and go to the end. Instead, you keep flashing back to a focus on one of the characters' experiences in the story, in the hatching and the carrying out of their plot to rob the racetrack. And it puts an emphasis upon how each one of these characters is caught in this plan that is supposed to be foolproof, but which is susceptible to all sorts of contingency. And it sets up a sense that people are, even when they're working together, are isolated and at the mercy of a world. Again, it's a and so Kubrick actually recut the film at one point because he thought maybe I would just keep it simple and tell the story from beginning to end as a narrative. But he went back to this structure of going back in time several times during the film, which is a feature of his original source material, Clean Break by Lionel White, something that makes that book more than just your typical caper story, because it does adopt this Rashomon structure of telling the story from the same story over and over from a different point of view that makes it much deeper than just a traditional action film.
Now, is that film produced? Oh, go ahead, Darren.
No, sorry, I was just going to say that it's because of the structure and the way that it's told. It's very similar to Reservoir Dogs, which maybe had influenced Reservoir Dogs as well, where it's about a bank heist, but it's almost not about a bank heist. It's about different characters' experiences with the preparation for the bank heist. It just follows a very similar structure to it.
Right, and the end of The Killing brings that full circle, because the ending of The Killing is different from the book. At the end, Johnny Clay has just seen his plot dissolve as a result of this ridiculous accident involving a dog and a luggage cart at the airport. And at the end, his girlfriend tells him, Johnny, you've got to run. And Johnny looks at a taxi that is driving away from him and a couple of detectives coming out of the airport who have been alerted to his presence and what is happening. And he says, what's the difference? That's Kubrick's world, is that what's the difference? I have no control.
Yeah. Was that the first film that Kubrick had produced with his partner, or was his partnership formed after that, and first one was Paths of Glory?
James Harris?
Yeah.
Yeah, James Harris was involved, wasn't he, Darren, in The Killing? I think that was their first collaboration.
Yeah, I think so. And then they brought Lolita together, and they wanted to do that in the future, and they did that in the line.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on then to Paths of Glory, because that's the one that really, I guess, both critically, filmically, this put him on the map as not just a guy to watch out for, but as a major film. And this also was a film. This was at the height of Kirk Douglas as an actor in the 50s. He was, along with one of the 3 or 4 biggest male stars in Hollywood. And he himself, I think, produced Paths of Glory. Well, no, it did. Maybe he didn't, but But anyway, he worked. He and Kubrick did the film, and in a sense, and on a certain narrative level, it's a very simple film. There's a sense of melodrama. There's a lot of room for Douglas to stick out his famous dimpled chin and ham it up a bit. But on the other hand, it has a lot of power too, not only because of the shots and whatnot. So let me start with you, Jeffrey. Then let's talk a little bit about that film and how that raised the ante. And do you agree that this was Kubrick at another level?
Well, Douglas hired Kubrick to direct this film. It was produced by Douglas's production company, Bryna Productions, and he hired Kubrick to direct the film because Douglas had been so impressed by The Killing. And Kubrick and Douglas apparently didn't get along. It was a matter of two very strong, egotistical persons clashing. But the result, as you said, was a marvelous film, a first-class bit of filmmaking. I think testimony to that would be the fact that the film was not shown in France until 1975. They just found it too threatening because it was based upon an actual incident in which some soldiers had been executed for not showing sufficient ardor in another useless World War I attack into machine guns and artillery. And Kubrick plays with this beautifully as he shows a tremendous class conflict between the officers who are aristocrats and the men who are from the lower orders of society. And Kirk Douglas, you're right, he plays sort of a typical hero, but it's a very Kubrickian film in that Kirk Douglas is one of these intermediate characters in Kubrick films that tries to somehow ameliorate the persecution of the lower orders of society by the higher orders of society. And in the end, he fails.
Darren, any comments on this film visually as a step up from earlier Kubrick works?
Yeah, I mean, visually you're starting to see a lot more of his one-point perspective shots that he uses a lot more in his later on films. And I know we talked about the Steadicam and The Shining, but the Steadicam at this point in cinema was like a whole new thing to see in Paths of Glory, so it really stood out as something special. But the thing that impresses me most about this film is the ending. And you know, Kubrick gets talked about being a very cold director in a lot of ways, but this film has so much heart at the end of the film, the way they wrap it up and give it like an emotional climax rather than something else. And it's just a very touching ending to the film. You know, Spielberg talked about in interviews after he heard that Kubrick has passed, that's the film, the ending he showed to his friend, because that's how they remembered him as actually a very emotional director. And that was the shot that he shared with his friends about it. So I would say it was a very important film for him. And also the time and period of life where he met his wife, which was a new period of his life. Right?
And his wife played the woman, the German, the captured German woman at the end, the Christiane. I know it's odd, Kubrick, and I'll talk a little bit more, especially with 2001, because that's another film that is called Emotionless and whatnot. But yeah, it's odd because the film also has a really dark sense of humor. The probably the most famous example is when one of the condemned is talking about dying in a few hours, and one of the bug, a cockroach or something, is going to be alive, and the other guy hits it and says, "Now you're ahead," or something along, now you got it on him. And
yeah, the guy says, in a few hours that cockroach will have more contact with my wife than I do. And then Timothy Carey was one of the famous crazy men of Hollywood, just smashes the cockroach and says, "Now you got the edge on him." Yeah. And you're right. I mean, Kubrick had this tremendous sort of mordant sense of humor that is very effective on a number of levels. Yeah, and that's a great scene.
And Tim Carey did play one of the hitmen in The Killing. And,
yes.
Then he's the guy, I think, who shoots the jockey off the horse, or tries to, or something.
Horse, right. Yeah. He's the paid assassin of the horse.
And Kubrick, I think, didn't he initially fire him off of The Killing? And I guess then he hired him back. Or was he fired? He might have been fired off of, was he fired off of Paths of Glory? Because I read or saw something on YouTube saying some of the shots you see just the back of the Carey character's head, and that was a stand-in because Carey apparently was womanizing too much off the set. I don't know if that's true, but from what you said, him being a notorious wild man, that sounds like it was the case.
I think there was some conflict over Carey's role. It might have involved Douglas or something. He was very difficult to work with, but I think Kubrick appreciated that because he thought Carey brought some of that sense of the grotesque that made Franz Kafka Kubrick's favorite author.
So if we move on, because the next film chronologically is Spartacus, although that wasn't really a Kubrick film. But did Kubrick have any projects before he took over? Because I think Anthony Mann, a well-known sort of studio director in comparison to Kubrick, was supposed to direct Spartacus, directed a couple of days, and Douglas, who was producing it, canned him. But did Kubrick was he trying to do Lolita at the time?
I think that's right.
Yeah,
I think he and Harris had a number of other properties, and including Lolita, Darren.
yeah, he bought it at this point already and was trying to get it made, but it was obviously very controversial. So I think Spartacus gave him the power to be able to do the project he wanted to do.
So, I mean, Spartacus always is the oddball because it wasn't really a Kubrick conceived property, and you know, there's the famous stories about Ben-Hur, about some homoeroticism in there. Was Spartacus a typical would you say sword and sandals kind of flick of the time, or because you know there's the famous I am Spartacus scene towards the end. What do you think, if anything? If you compare that to a Ben-Hur, what makes it more Kubrickian than say a Ben-Hur? Do you think?
Well, it was very successful at the time. It did very well, but I think Kubrick talks about in an audio interview that you can find on YouTube somewhere that it was more of an intellectual exercise for him to be able to try and make things work that he didn't think were that great. And so it was more of an exercise for him as well as giving him the power to facilitate the next project that he wanted to make, which was Lolita.
Jeffrey, do you have any comments about Spartacus?
Well, Douglas and Kubrick fought over this, and Kubrick also fought with the person who wrote the screenplay, Dalton Trumbo, because Kubrick had a different view of the revolt led by Spartacus. Kubrick wanted to make Arthur Koestler's The Gladiators the basis for the film, and Koestler's point in The Gladiators is that revolutions often go terribly wrong. Koestler, of course, had his own experience with the Russian Revolution going terribly wrong. And he wrote The Gladiators and showed that once the Spartacus revolt had reached a certain degree of ascendancy, there were problems, there were atrocities, there were things going wrong, partly from the idealism. But Dalton Trumbo and Douglas wanted to make a statement about the nobility of revolution against oppression. And of course, Trumbo, of course, was a victim of McCarthyite purges. And so he wanted to make Spartacus very much a hero of the liberal Hollywood left against conservative political oppression in the United States. And Kubrick just disagreed with that. But he lost that fight because it was a Douglas production. And as Darren said, he was brought in after Anthony Mann was let go. And so he didn't have any right or any control over the screenplay or the interpretation. And so that's why the Spartacus ends up being a rather extremely sentimental and very positive and sort of feel-good sword and sandal epic that's a cut above, so to speak, other sword and sandal epics of the time, but certainly, as you say, is not a Kubrickian film.
Do you think that he would have ever have done a film like this had he not been just doing it to sort of to establish himself? Do you think that kind of material would have even interested a Kubrick?
I'm not aware that he had interest in any similar sorts of properties.
Okay, so his historical bent didn't go back to the Roman Republic, I guess.
No, he's very much interested in the modern era.
Yeah,
that's what really characterizes his historical concerns.
Darren, did you have something to say?
No, I was just thinking in terms of that was the point in his career where he handled like a film of that budget on that scale before, so that was like a new step for him. So that was maybe something else that drew towards that project as well as for his own learning curve, I guess.
First Kubrick production was Lolita, which was an adaptation of the Nabokov novel, and I know that some of the major changes there, the biggest one was that I think in the book Lolita is 12 or 13, and in the film, I forget the name of the actress, she's like 22 or 24 that's playing it. So this was back in it was made in 62, but through the late 50s or 60s when this was being developed, it was thought to be an unfilmable novel because no one would want to see a novel about pederasty or pedophilia. Talk, Jeffrey, just historically a little bit about the problem of the Nabokov novel and translating it to film.
Well, it was a huge problem, of course, because as Nabokov defined it. A nymphet, which was his term, is a girl of between 9 and 12 years old. And so, and in the film, Sue Lyon, the actress who played Lolita, was 15 at the time she was hired and 16 when they were making the film. So,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, they made it into a teenager, which made it marginally acceptable. And of course, they cut out a lot of the novel. So that was a problem. But otherwise, you can see why Kubrick was interested in this particular novel, because it's a wonderful portrayal of the collision between high intellect and culture and base, absolutely uncontrollable desire that Humbert suffers from in dealing with this. He is literally helpless in the face of the sexual desire that this young girl produces in him. And the other delight about watching Lolita are the circumlocutions that Kubrick uses to introduce just a bit of the sexual content from Nabokov. For example, when he's trying to decide where to live at this particular place, and he's taken back out into the garden by the landlady who showed him the house, and she's been talking about all of the things that she can do for him, which has its own sexual undertones, and he sees Lolita in her bikini out in the back. And suddenly he's made his decisions, and he says, well, I will take this rental. And she says, well, what made you decide? And he said, oh, your cherry pies. And it's a quite innocent statement, but it's also terribly dirty and explicit.
Before I get into some of the visual stuff with Darren, Peter Sellers makes his appearance here. Was Sellers a big star in England at the time, or was this sort of his coming out party as an actor?
I think he was well established in the 50s. He had made a number of films, but I think it's under Kubrick's direction that he perfects this tradition of playing multiple characters in the same film, in Lolita and in Strangelove.
And I think he did.
It does mark a further emergence of Sellers as a major cinema star.
And I think he did so in some of those sort of all-star comedies of the 1960s too. He played multiple characters in a number of those kinds of films. The thing that strikes me just narratively about Lolita, when I think that came out just like a year and a half after Psycho, and I look at like the way that Hollywood approached sexuality and violence throughout the 1950s. Most quite different, because in a sense it's about pedophilia, it's about the murder, it's about obsession, it's about stalking. I mean, and yet in a sense it's done almost with like a surgical like precision, whereas today, you know, it would be so. I think that it was actually redone in the 90s, and it's a far inferior film. What do you think? What do you think a film like this might have been, say, in a Hitchcock or a Preminger's hands? And do you think that the Kubrick approach was different and better? Do you think, for that kind of material, Jeffrey?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Could I defer to Darren? He might have a better answer than I.
Go ahead, Darren.
I was just thinking, I think the way that Kubrick was able to get away with it was the point of view in which he told the story. Is he doesn't focus so much on the issues that make it controversial. He focuses on the weakness of the male in this character, how difficult he finds the situation. And I think it's almost the slight bit of empathy that you give to that character is the way that the audience buys into that story and almost goes through the torture within this character. I think when we were talking about that garden scene you were mentioning, Jeffrey, where Lolita is lying on the towel sunbathe, and that's probably one of the most iconic Kubrick shots. I mean, if you haven't even seen Lolita, you recognize that image from somewhere. But one of my favorite things from that film is not just the sexual nature of things, because it isn't really that explicit in things that it shows. It's like the suggestion of something sexual. So, for example, the scene when the main character is with the mother, but then he looks at the picture of Lolita on the bedstand, and there's a lot of great stuff going on in that scene, you know. So those are some of my favorite kind of moments from that film.
Yeah, James Mason, it should be said, is one of those performances. You know, there are performances that are famous, like Robert De Niro in Raging Bull, or you know, things, a few John Wayne performances, or but Mason really dominates that film. I mean, I think, you know, Sellers has in a sense the showier, flashier roles because he's playing Claire Quilty, he's playing a few other characters, but what Darren mentioned, if James Mason was just playing your typical 1950s starched collar kind of guy, he wouldn't have been that sympathetic. Here he is, a guy that I think he's a university president or something, or I know he's a teacher at a university, but you get that he's really this pathetic, wimpy, to use the modern term, pussy whipped kind of guy who probably has a whole boatload of neuroses, and yet you never see them. In a modern film, you would probably get a flashback to something that happened when he was 3 or whatnot. Whereas here we're just dealing with the guy here, and we have to project into him to see, okay, why is he this way? There's something wrong though. Jeffrey, do you have a comment on Mason's performance? Because I think it's an underrated part of that film.
I think you're right. It's a wonderful performance. And I think the ending is very much like Darren characterizing the ending of Paths of Glory. It's very sentimental and it's very sad. And even though you're appalled at Humbert and his immaturity and his exploitation of Lolita, at the end is an extremely sad story. You feel sorry for everyone involved. And I think that's a reflection of Kubrick's basic attitude toward life on this planet, is that we need to have a lot of sympathy for ourselves because we just keep getting ourselves into situations over which we have less control than we would like to think. And the best we can do is trying to do the best we can do, which more often than not is not enough.
Well, Darren, do you have any final comments before we end this segment?
Yeah, well, that just kind of goes back to what you were talking about with Rashomon, where the lesson in that film is kind of to do with everybody has the ability to be good and everybody has evil within them also. How do you go ahead and live your life when you could be either or? And it's so interesting to see a film that shows a good guy caught in a bad situation, and that it's a sign that the film works. The fact that you feel empathy towards him at the end of the film means that the film is a success if you do find at that point.
Okay, well, let's end this segment. When we get back, we'll talk about what I guess would consider maybe the 3 big films that people identify with Kubrick, and arguably, I don't know if any director anywhere has had a run of 3 such monumentally great films as Dr. Strangelove, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and A Clockwork Orange. We'll do that in a moment. All right, I mentioned before we broke that the 3-film run of Strangelove, 2001, and Clockwork Orange is, in my mind, arguably the best 3-film run that I can think of that any director might have had. So let's talk about Strangelove, because that was, I believe, his last black and white film. And one of the famous stories that I hear about that film was starts with the sort of Kubrick legend of him being a bit of an oddball, and that's with the famous war room table needing to be in green felt, even though it's a black and white film. And it just goes to show you that some people, and I think Kurosawa was that way too, in that he would go to exotic little companies in faraway parts of Japan to get the slightest little historical detail in a second that would shot that would last a second as the camera just went around. But okay, Dr. Strangelove, 1962. This is just I guess this was being filmed probably right around the Cuban Missile Crisis, and here we get a film that is one of the great comedies, albeit a dark comedy, of all time, and it's about the end of everything. So, historically speaking, Jeffrey, let me start with you. I know originally they were going to try to make it, I think it was a Red Alert or something might have been the name of the book it was supposedly adapted from. What prompted the change to the mordant humor and whatnot?
Well, Kubrick's story is that he was going over this with James Harris, or perhaps at an early stage, or perhaps later with well, with someone, and he said that at some point it became clear to him that the situation was so absurd that the only way he presented it was as a comedy, as a black comedy. Had he kept with his original plan, it would have ended up being the film's Failsafe, which came out at the same time as Dr. Strangelove, which by its own rights is a very, very good, straight, dramatic film. But Kubrick obviously was looking deeper, and he had a sensibility, I think, of the 60s of being iconoclastic and of questioning authority. And so he obviously thought that the best way to get at this is a sort of Swiftian analysis of the absurdity of the situation in which we find ourselves that could result in the destruction of the entire planet. And for him, again, his favorite author was Kafka. And Kafka would have looked at this and would have used humor and pointed out that we are in this grotesque world, and the origins of our discontents are our world that are inherent in it. They aren't imposed upon us by anything outside. And so, of course.
Yeah, and the thing with that film is it's one of his shorter films. I think it's only like 94, 96 minutes or something. But it's such a dense film in the best sense of the word, is that virtually every shot, virtually every scene is iconic. There's the shooting of the, I think it's Coca-Cola machine. There's the guys flying and reading off the absurd things that they need to do to fly the plane. There's the fluoridated water with Hayden back there. There's at the end the Mein Führer, and I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it's like it's almost like, what film is this? I mean, the only other film that I can think of that has as densely packed and as memorable scenes is maybe La Dolce Vita. That's maybe the only film that I think that every scene is just iconic in its own right. So let me go with that, Darren. As a visual film, this film mixes things, because there's the famous Burleson Air Force Base scene where the U.S. Air Force or whatever is trying to take back the base for the Crazy Ripper, and it actually wasn't footage. It was actually filmed by a secondary crew to look like World War II or Korean War footage. Talk a little bit about the visuals of this film and how that helped Strangelove be what it is.
Visually, my favorite thing about the film is just that war room. It's such an iconic thing to remember from that film. And then the replication of being inside of the planes they're flying through, when even the people who created the planes from the military were surprised how accurate Kubrick had got it, based on the fact that there was no information basically out there about the design of those planes.
If you could speak up a little bit, Darren.
Yeah, sorry, you can't hear me. My favorite thing about the film is that he really starts to get into themes of sex and power within these films, and about masculinity really forcing themselves to be in charge of the world. And there are so many subtle hints all throughout the film that just demonstrate, and even down to Sterling Hayden's performance, the reason that he tries to kind of blow up the world is because he has a little bit of an issue with performance, and that's one of the reasons he starts to lose it and leads him down this path. And there are so many little subtle moments that are to do with sex and male ego and power. And it's those themes that I think are so layered throughout such a tight film like we're talking about, that makes it a very timeless film. And we're talking about all Kubrick films, right?
Yeah, George C. Scott, another famous story is how Kubrick tricked the performance that George C. Scott gives by saying, George, just do these first few performances really over the top and whatnot, and then do a serious performance. And from what I've read and also seen in a few little online documentaries, that I think Scott was actually expecting a film like Failsafe. Did he actually know he was in a comedy? Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Oh, well, originally Scott expressed frustration that Kubrick kept Kubrick habit of doing take after take, saying, well, there's a lot of good stuff here, let's go again, and encouraging Scott to play the character as broadly as he could. And Scott was very discontented at the time, but some years later, Scott conceded that Kubrick was right, that it made it a great film and a great performance by him simply because Kubrick insisted upon this extremely broad presentation of these characters to make them look ridiculous. And what Darren says about sexuality here is, I think, very important because, and I think we see a connection here between Lolita and Dr. Strangelove. Kubrick was very interested in the works of Freud, and in Dr. Strangelove, following upon Lolita, upon threatened masculinity and fear of women, going back to the helplessness of the male child vis-a-vis its mother and the male identity and so forth. And so it's very much a film that it's interesting to watch Dr. Strangelove along with Hitchcock's Vertigo, which is also a film that deals with issues of males and their fear of women and desire for women, that puts in question their masculinity and indeed their mortality and everything else. And so, and the other thing that I see in Strangelove is, of course, the first relatively full invocation of the Biden's of the Nazi in the modern world. Sellers' portrayal as Dr. Strangelove is very much a Kubrickian creation in that Kubrick is looking at the modern 20th century world as a world that reflects Nazism, that this is one of the great powers that defeated the Nazis, but here is a Nazi at the center of decision-making about destruction of the world. And I've argued in my book, The Wolf at the Door, and in subsequent articles, that there's actually a double ending to Strangelove. The ending, of course, is the classic black comedy ending, the destruction of the world by the doomsday machine and the setting off of all these nuclear weapons. But Kubrick twists the blade again because there's a second ending that's already been alluded to in the course of the film. And that is that the end of the world is not the end of the world, because there will be a selection of superior beings who will hide in mine shafts, according to Dr. Strangelove's instructions and recommendations, who will emerge after about 100 years to inherit the world. Yeah. And this is Kubrick's vision of a world that has been cleared of all inferior types and the emergence of a Strangelove Nazi progeny to reestablish the world under Nazi leadership.
Yeah, and it's funny because you mentioned that because you have basically this Nazi, this twisted, deformed Nazi that's sort of the spiritual leader, and he's sort of leading the communist, the Russian guy that they allow in, and the capitalist, and all of them have that moment when I think Strangelove is talking about, you know, fertile young women that will have to be selected, and you can almost see. You can see sort of George C. Scott. You can see the communist guy. You can see all of their eyes sort of popping out like a Warner Brothers cartoon character, you know, with just salivating over the idea. And it's like they're all just going to march lockstep into this sort of underground from an H.G. Wells, like the Morlocks and the Eloys, and then emerge after 100 years. But Darren, do you have any comments further on anything?
No, I just think tying in with this, we're talking about sex and power there, just with the whole conversation at the end wraps up those themes really nicely, where all the guys have the idea of repopulating the earth, where they have to take on many wives to be able to do so. It's just such a crazy suggestion for them. And then even Dr. Strangelove, as he stands up at the end, literally becomes erect, and it's all these kind of male symbols and everything. And I love Dr. Strangelove. It's a really good film.
Yeah, and then right after he does his Heil salute, you see the bomb, you know, the load being shot off. So let's talk about, just before we move on, Sellers in Strangelove versus Sellers in Lolita, because certainly I think that the three characters, and I think did he play 3 or 4 in Lolita?
3.
3. Okay, so what, in a sense, do you think that was sort of a dry run, because the 3 characters he plays are so iconic. I mean, the president is Merkin Muffley, and Merkin is supposedly, I guess, in the mid 20th or early 20th century, is a vaginal wig, and Muffley is slang for vagina. And then he plays uh, uh, what's the guy who tries to stop Ripper's name? The lieutenant that he plays, that shoots out the soda machine.
Lionel Mandrake.
Yeah, Mandrake. Yeah, another illusion. And then of course, Strangelove. Uh, so, do you see that as a? How would you compare the multiple performances in each of those films, Jeffrey? Do you think?
He also plays a German in Lolita, Dr. Zem,
Yeah.
who's an early iteration of Strangelove, much more mild, of course.
And he originally was supposed pilot, wasn't he?
That's right. But then he broke his leg or something.
Yeah.
In an accident, and they had to get Slim Pickens.
Yeah.
So he was supposed to play four.
Yeah.
But I think Lolita, for all of its qualities, is, as you've indicated, not as Kubrickian or as great a film as Strangelove is, because Strangelove really broke new ground. And so Sellers' performances in there, which were largely ad-libbed, as Sellers was wont to do, those performances were in service to a film that you can... I think Strangelove is significant because it's the first fully Kubrickian film, that it's unique in and of itself. Lolita, in some ways, is traditional with Kubrick touches and Kubrick themes and concerns, but I think the thing that makes Strangelove and 2001 and Clockwork Orange great, as you say, maybe the best run of 3 films that any director has ever had, was the fact that they were fully Kubrick's vision, and they gave rise, I think, to the adjective Kubrickian.
Yeah. Well, let's then turn to 2001, because it was a 5-year 5 years between the release of Strangelove and 2001, and we had mentioned earlier about the end of Paths of Glory, and I remember the first time that I ever saw 2001 must have been about 76 or 77. It was on late night television in New York City from like 11:30 to 2:30, and I remember the first time I saw it, it must have been about 10 or 11. I remember crying during the scene where Hal gets disconnected, and I never understood why people always said it wasn't emotional, because for me, there's very little dialogue in that film relative to its length, but yet there's not every word virtually. I mean, even an and or an article seems to have impact in that film. And of course, you go for the first 20 minutes or so with the cavemen sequence. So let's talk a little bit about. Let me start with Darren first on this one, because a lot of people, from what I read, don't know that that wasn't filmed in Africa. The scenes with the cavemen, that's actually a painted background. But yet, when you look at it, it's hard to, even now, 50 years on almost, to see that as a painted background. Talk a little bit about the visuals of that opening shot, Darren, and then some of the other things in 2001 that are so iconic.
Yeah, so the opening scene, they used front screen projection to capture some of those shots. So they have the characters, and then some of the foreground that is actually practically there, and they used almost like a projection screen to almost foreshadow the images in the background to create like a level of depth there. So it's front screen projection is the term that they use for it, and it basically allowed Kubrick to use different backgrounds without going to different locations. And that's what kind of creates the different loop with the opening of the Dawn of Man sequence. But my favorite thing about 2001 is it was actually re-released here when Interstellar came out, because there was all this buzz about space films. So I actually got to see it in the cinema for the first time ever, just a little while ago when Interstellar came out. And the thing to note about it, how you were talking about it being emotional, is that as much as it has so much groundbreaking visual work, so much groundbreaking practical effects, and a crazy story, the fact is that it's an experience film. It's a very visceral movie that affects you in very strange ways, musically, visually, that it's very hard to put something into words that wasn't really intended to be in words in the first place, So it's a hard film to talk about, but it's an experience movie more than anything else for me.
Jeffrey, your opening comments about 2001?
Well, I would agree that it's both an intellectual and an emotional experience. It's one of the most comprehensive works of art ever produced because it is a contemplation of the entire arc of humanity, from its origins back down the evolutionary ladder up through its future into a further evolution into a higher level of being. And yet still it's very Kubrickian too in the Strangelovian sense, in that at the end there's a certain ambiguity. While you're supposed to be inspired by that, the star child who is going to inherit the earth and perhaps bring a higher level of civilization, you have to wonder if beings with a newer model of human beings, what form will the transformation take when the star child returns to Earth as representative of a new order of humanity? What happens to the older human beings? And that's traditional Kubrick ambiguity that makes us think about the prices that we may pay for seeking perfection.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because 16 years later, in 1984, they made a sequel based on the Arthur Clarke sequel to the book, 2010, and that's a good, solid science fiction film. But you look at 2001, and a lot of times, in both in writing and in film, there's a tendency, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, people always want to know everything. But in order to get a viewer or a reader into something, you have to leave things sometimes ambiguous or unanswered, because you have to draw the percipient in to fill in the blanks, because you're never, if you're reading Huckleberry Finn, your Huckleberry Finn isn't going to look exactly like Huckleberry Finn does in my mind, and what you fill in the blanks in a film is not going to be exactly what Darren would or what I would. And so your 2001 is going to be different than my 2001. I might look at it as an allegory, if this is 1968 and I'm watching it, as a youthful rebellion and the coming new ageism kind of thing. Someone else will look at it as a cautionary tale against technology and so forth. In that way, I think Kubrick was very much ahead of the curve in terms of his writing, and I think it's a brilliant screenplay. People think you have to have a talky screenplay. I did a show on John Cassavetes, and at his best, Cassavetes is the other extreme. But still, let's talk a little bit about the screenplay there. I mean, you have these three basic acts. You have, just images in the first act. Then you have what seems to be, what could be a standard kind of James Bondian kind of plot. What's going on at the moon base, whatnot. Then we finally see that they had uncovered the monolith, and then we get sort of this Homeric journey out towards Jupiter. If you're reading the book, it's Saturn. But and then we just get sort of this ending that throws everyone. Talk a little bit about Jeffrey, maybe the arc of the film. Do you see it being as a circular kind of a film, or a linear?
Well, he was clearly inspired by Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal return, and also by Nietzsche's work, Thus Spake Zarathustra, in which Nietzsche predicts the evolution of humanity to a status beyond the sort of slave mentality that Nietzsche saw as characteristic of Christianity, where we subordinate ourselves to this all-powerful God, and instead Nietzsche was saying we need to accept our own powers and energies and live without the illusion of God. And it's interesting how Kubrick certainly embraces that at the end, and this is why some people responded so positively to the film, because there's this sense that this is about the possibility of further development of humanity in an extremely exciting and positive way. And in that sense, 2001 is as good a primer on Kubrick's view of humanity as any of the films he made. And I think actually Kubrick put this in terms of a criticism that he had, that he was answering about A Clockwork Orange. And Kubrick said, it seems to me that human beings are not, like Rousseau said, fallen angels. They are, in fact, risen apes. And that's better, because it means that we are developing. And I think it shows that Kubrick was both a modernist and a postmodernist. He was a modernist insofar as that he hoped that human beings could use their reason to develop as good a civilization as might be possible, and that this would be problematic, but it's better than assuming that we descended from angels and somehow we have to get back to the past and assume this level of perfection. He also, in terms of what you were saying about leaving things open, Kubrick was very much a postmodernist too, because he did have this style of open narrative, not preaching to you and saying, okay, here's the answer. It's rather, here's an ambiguous situation. Which way do you take it? He wants to engage the... So I think 2001, in some ways, is a seminal film in terms of Kubrick making clear what his view of the human condition is, and then asking people to weigh in with their own thoughts and reflections and feelings.
Darren, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things about this film is, you were talking about before about how Kubrick chose to present this film, and talking about the version from the book and things, or from the screenplay. And for me, in terms of making a cinematic film, and Kubrick talked about this as the least effective way to do it is directly through dialogue and things. And he talks about the way that when you teach somebody something and you just tell them the answer, it doesn't mean anything to them. But if you can lead them to discovery of something, then they own it. And that's very much what Kubrick has done in this film. And so there's also something very special about how he crafts his film, because it's designed in a way so that it rewards multiple viewings. So you can watch 2001 that just offers so much more as you watch it so many different times, and you can see something very different at different stages of life or a different viewing number along the line. And I don't know, I haven't seen it a long time ago and I watched it fairly recently. It gets into your brain and gets you thinking about all these different things that it's very different depending on what stage you are in life. One of the things I talked about in analysis videos is the film isn't really, sorry, I forgot how it goes. I think it's, the film isn't, your interpretation of the film is more a reflection of you than the film itself, and that's kind of how I think 2001 says for me.
Right, is film a window or a mirror?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on to Clockwork Orange, this was the film that really, I think, started the trend, speaking of tropes, of Kubrick films getting hammered critically initially, and then within a decade or so, reassessments coming. So let's talk a little bit about that, because really every film from 2001 to Eyes Wide Shut basically went through the same pattern critically, is that there were maybe a few people that recognized the quality of whatever the film was at the moment, but usually it got hammered, and usually it got hammered not usually for filmic reasons, but usually for social or cultural reasons at the time, and then it's been reassessed. So let's talk a little bit just before we move on. 2001, it really, I think, just totally baffled people, because before that, maybe you had maybe Forbidden Planet, a dozen years earlier, which was a good, solid, sci-fi 50s film. It also had a little bit of iconography in its own right, but this was such a leap up. I think more than even the literature of, say, Asimov or Clarke or Heinlein, this itself made science fiction seem that it could be art. And I think that just went past people. Talk a little bit maybe about one or two of the people that maybe that really didn't get it. Is there any famous criticism about this film that really looks stupid in retrospect?
Well, there's that famous clip of Rock Hudson walking out of the Hollywood premiere of 2001 and saying, "What the hell was that about?" And it was interesting, when I first went to see Eyes Wide Shut, and the theater was full because everybody had heard all these lurid tales about how sexy it was going to be and how there was so much sex going on during the production of the film. And of course, when people saw it, they were baffled
Yeah.
because it was Kubrick. It wasn't just any old film. And I remember some guy standing up at the end of that film, and it may be significant that he said exactly the same thing as Rock Hudson. He said, "What the hell was that about?" And I think that shows that even if you don't understand a Kubrick film, you're aware that there's something fundamental and almost visceral going on here that may disturb you and bother you, not just because you don't understand it, because maybe on some subliminal level, you do. It really gets to you somehow, even if you don't understand how.
Yeah, so keeping in that vein, probably his most critically, scorchingly scathing reviews came from the next film, A Clockwork Orange, and I think because Darren's in the UK, I think that was what banned for 25 or 30 years from being even viewed in the cinemas there. Is that so?
Originally, and then I think he decided to pull it because he was getting a lot of death threats close to where he lived, and I think it wasn't forced upon him. I think it was a choice at the beginning.
Yeah, and there was supposedly some copycat Droog-like activity, supposedly.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that film, Darren, just visually, because as iconic as the 2001 cinematography is, Kubrick does, I think, even more in this film, from the speeded up sex scenes to the phantasmagoric scenes that we see when he has the Ludovico treatment and the eyes held open, the Catwoman scenes, both the first one where he kills her and the second one where he's then subdued by the strong man. What other than some of these things I mentioned, what stands out to you visually about Kubrick in this film? That anything that maybe he grew, or anything that stands out as something that you didn't expect in the film?
It's definitely a very challenging film that asks you to really engage with it. And I think he definitely likes to play with the form in this film because it's a film that's so bizarre with a lot of its issues that it's okay to support the narrative with directorial choices that mirror those choices. So one of the things I like about the film is the fact that it's very much ahead of its time being a confrontational film, but if you haven't seen the film before, it has this reputation about violence and about it's mostly about violence and the way that that's affected the film. But really, when the violence is only the first maybe quarter of the film, there's really this incredible character study after that ties in with. It's almost like a backstory about how did this happen to this character, and how does this character live with this violence that's happened in his life. So for me, it's more a character study than it is a horrible violence film. It has this horrible reputation.
Yeah, Jeffrey, pick up on that. Do you see that more as a sort of a Bildungsroman of Alex the Droog?
Well, it certainly is that. It's as you certainly know, Kubrick read the American edition of Clockwork Orange, which left off the last chapter, in which Alec, as a man with a family in his 20s, is reflecting back on these wild teenage years. And there's some sense in the novel that he's learned from this and that he is going to mature into a more responsible member of society. Burgess himself was a Pelagian Catholic who put an emphasis upon the importance of moral choice, which of course is represented in the film as well as in the novel. But Kubrick read the American edition, which ends without Alex reflecting back in a mature fashion upon the excesses of his youth. And I think in that respect, Kubrick intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or subconsciously, is channeling the disillusion of the late 1960s and the 1970s with the sort of hippy-dippy optimism of the age of Aquarius of the 1960s. Now he's going back on his more traditional turf of looking at how powerful regimes and governments manipulate people, in this case, the use of behavioral science to manipulate people. And it's very much a story of how what is ultimately a fascist government ends up using Alex for its own designs in order to persecute and imprison its political opponents and establish some sort of fascist regime. And so A Clockwork Orange is also, among other things, a political statement that what we face is what Kubrick once told his wife near the end of his life. He said, the only thing you really have to fear is power, human beings with power. And that comes through very clearly at the end of Clockwork Orange.
And it's interesting because Malcolm McDowell was like 26 when he was filmed, so he was significantly older than Alex the teenager, just like Sue Lyon was older than Lolita. And Malcolm McDowell, I think this was only his second or third film. His first film, I think, was If by Lindsay Anderson, where he played a similarly delinquent kind of character that at the end they shoot up a school, and I think he's killed off a rooftop, and he doesn't. It's almost as if that his Alex is almost but it's almost like it's a reinterpretation of that character, except this version of the character is a bit smarter. He knows how to manipulate the system.
Mm-hmm. Right, and you've got a system that is ready, willing, and able to exploit him in order to secure and enhance its power. Although I recently read another analysis of the film that suggests that that last sequence, or the last shot of the film that shows Alex in this sort of dreamlike landscape surrounded by a group of people dressed in their finest Ascot finery, applauding him while he has sex with a woman. That's been interpreted in this particular analysis as a representation of Burgess's last chapter. The woman is on top, and that Kubrick is saying there that Alex, in fact, in line with what Darren was saying about the evolution of character, the development of the character here is becoming more responsible. I don't know if I agree with that analysis, but it's certainly worth thinking about. And again, I think it's another sign of Kubrick being ambiguous and being open narrative and saying, well, what do you think?
It's interesting. I thought you were going to say that person was going to argue sort of the Taxi Driver thing, where at the end, some people think De Niro actually dies in the shootout, and that the ending of Taxi Driver is just his last second dream or something. But what you had mentioned, the ending of the American Book, and this prefigures some of the complaints that Stephen King fans have had about The Shining. I think if I read both the book and seen the film, and I think the film's ending is much better. And the Burgess book, I think, is a good book. I don't think it's nearly as good a book as some of the other utopian or dystopian novels, but I think this is an example, just like later on in The Shining, where Kubrick made absolutely the right choice. I don't think if he had bookended it with Alex, 8 years later, with a baby on the way and whatnot, I think it would have just been a pin that popped the balloon.
Yeah, it would have been more like a conventional Bildungsroman.
Yeah,
as you said. And that has value, but it wouldn't have had the richness and the ambiguity that Kubrick's ending has.
Yeah. Darren, you look like you want to say something?
No, I haven't read the book before. I realized that was the original ending in the book, but that's that'd be a bit of a cop-out because emotionally that's kind of where it should end at the end of that film. It's the tragedy of kind of where it's going anyway.
Okay, well, let's take a little break here, and when we get back, we'll talk about the post or the last 25 years or so of Kubrick. And I think he only did Barry Lyndon, Shining. So he only did 4 films, Full Metal Jacket and Eyes Wide Shut. So when we get back, we'll speak of those last 4 films, and we'll do that in just a moment.